We are joined by Senator Steve Daines of Montana to talk about conservation, perhaps a little bit on the environmental front too, and firearms, because I think it's very prudent to say that firearms and conservation actually do go hand in hand. So Senator Daines, thank you so much for chatting with me.
Hey, thanks, Gabriella. Good to be with you.
Likewise, it's really cool to pick your brain because you are actually what I think one Montana publication called a conservative conservationist. So I thought you'd be the perfect person to talk about these issues with. Since you are a sportsman and outdoorsman, you represent a Western state. So talk about the genesis of how you got interested in these issues and why you partake in these activities.
Well, I was very thankful that I got to grow up in Montana. In fact, I said the best decision I ever made in my life was when I picked my great-great-grandmother. She homesteaded north of Great Falls, Montana, a long time ago, back at the turn of the 19th century. And so growing up in Montana, it's a way of life for us. I mean, it was hunting and fishing. My earliest memories of getting that first Winchester 22, a pellet gun as well, a Daisy BB gun. And it's just, that was where I started fishing. I had a fly rod in my hand in the early 70s before fly fishing was cool. My grandpa had a Browning Silaflex rod with an automatic reel, a wicker creel. If you've seen the movie A River Runs Through It, that was filmed on the Gallatin River, most of it, and a river that I grew up fishing on before it was found and discovered, probably by so many now, has become a popular sport. So anyway, I just grew up that way, hunting antelope, hunting deer, hunting elk, backpacking up in the Beartooth Wilderness area from the earliest days, hiking with family. So it just really was ingrained in me at the very earliest. I thought everybody lived that way, because you grow up, you don't know until as I got into my college years and then left Montana State University, left Montana for a few years, I realized what I grew up with was something really unique and really special. And it's part of our legacy that we need to continue to protect and preserve in Montana.
Yes, and that is why I think in the last few years, we've seen a lot more, I would say, Republicans like yourself trying to take a lead on these issues. And like I'd mentioned earlier, you have been called a conservative conservationist. Why is it important, especially in this new political era we're in, to see Republicans take the lead on conservation issues, especially against what we're starting to see, and that can be argued as kind of this preservationist, environmentalist ethos?
Yeah, well, I think it's unfortunate that conservation has gotten so politicized that somehow if you are conservative, if you're Republican, you can't be pro-environment, pro-outdoors, pro-public lands, because I am. And as you mentioned, one of the great compliments I had was a headline that called me the conservative conservationist. And I think about what we have in Montana is that if you don't have a balance on these views here as it relates to allowing us to responsibly develop our natural resources, we must continue to do that for a lot of reasons. But one is to have an economy and jobs, because if we don't have a natural resource economy in a place like Montana, then ultimately it's just the rich and famous. They'll be able to live in a place like Montana, and the average working men and women will have to leave because they don't have a job. As we've seen some of these radical environmental groups shut down mining, shut down timber management, shut down oil, gas, and our coal industries. Well, what do you have if you shut all those down? You basically just have a state that only people who are wealthy can afford to live in.
And do you see this kind of preservationist ethos being promulgated by now Secretary Haaland, who you actually grilled? And I think it's appropriate to do it if you're going to be a department head and a cabinet member overseeing the department that oversees all public lands, natural resources, wildlife. Do you worry that she's going to head in that direction despite her? I wouldn't say she really gave you an affirmative answer about her changing, but has she expressed an interest to work with Western senators like you to promote true conservation, or is she still kind of stuck in her preservationist and kind of inclined to that philosophy more so? Or is she willing to bend, or are you worried she's not going to kind of listen to the interests out west?
Well, I hope so. I really do, now that she is our Secretary of Interior, that we can find a way to work together, that we don't lock up all of our public lands such that, again, we can't get access to them, because, as I think about a state like Montana, we're a blend of, as I said, we're a blend of Merle Haggard and John Denver. I mean, it's that melody you got to understand here, and that balanced view that I think we need to have going forward, where most Montanans are. But she has taken some very radical positions prior to her nomination, shutting down all pipelines, shutting down natural resource development, opposed to public lands trapping to allow our trappers to have to trap. I mean, that's part of our heritage in Montana. And then, of course, we got into a bit of a debate on the Endangered Species Act. And we look at what's happened with the grizzly bears in a place like Montana. When I was growing up, Gabriella, in Montana, we only had a couple hundred grizzly bears, and they were on the endangered species list. And they set targets like in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, like 300 bears. They raised it to 500 bears. And once it got to that level, we should delist or celebrate the recovery of this amazing animal, a grizzly bear, but return the management species back to the states, like we did with wolves back in 2011. Let the state of Montana manage that species. Well, now today there's over 1,000 grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Tragically, just last week, an hour and a half from my home in Southwest Montana, a 40-year-old man from West Yellowstone, Montana, was tragically mauled and killed by a grizzly bear. And so it's in the best interest for the people of Montana and the bears to delist them and allow the state of Montana to manage the species. So that's a place where Secretary Haaland said she wanted to keep the bears on the endangered species list forever, in perpetuity. Well, I've got a different view on that, and so do most Montanans.
It's also in the science too. Wildlife biologists have come to a consensus that the bear has very successfully recovered. You're citing the KO2 method. I saw that figure, the 1,000 figure, which is amazing because it means that they probably were underplaying the level of recovery of the bears. And it's going to lead to more bear-human conflicts. I think even bear-to-bear conflict too. I think people forget and I haven't been to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in a while, but when you have these highly aggressive bears that are not managed, these grizzlies, they also attack other grizzlies, they attack other bears, black bears, other brown bears in the ecosystems, and also they predate livestock as well. So I don't think people understand the conflict until maybe, let's say, a bear is in downtown Washington, D.C. or in downtown New York City.
Well, I spend a lot of time in grizzly country. In fact, I'm an avid hunter. I love to hunt predators. I get out, I hunt wolves, mountain lions, black bears, but oftentimes I'm right in the middle of the ecosystem where the grizzly bears are absolutely everywhere. And I'll tell you, you've got to be very, very careful. And I take all the precautions. I have bear spray as well as a firearm when I'm out in grizzly country. But you're exactly right. The science is telling us just quantitatively. I'm a chemical engineer by degree, Gabrielle. I like to look at the numbers and the science. The science tells us the bear now has exceeded the recovery targets. Let's celebrate that we've actually recovered the species of Endangered Species Act, and let's delist them, move the management species back to Montana, like we did with wolves. That's working very well, by the way, letting Montana manage a predator like the wolf. But it's in the best interest of the bears. It's in the best interest for the people. It's the best interest for agriculture. As you mentioned, predator losses. The number one loss in livestock now in Montana is grizzly bears. It's not wolves, it's not mountain lions, it's grizzly bears. We have families up along the Rocky Mountain front there, along the Bob Marshall Wilderness area there, where they have to walk their children to the bus stop. They're armed in the morning because there's so many grizzly bears now that, remember when Lewis and Clark came out to Montana, the grizzly bears were on the plains. Mm-hmm. Grizzly bears are omnivores. They eat primarily grass and berries and so forth. They also eat meat, but let's not forget the fact we now have grizzly bears out in the wheat fields of Montana in places like Conrad and outside of Great Falls. And so we need to delist the bear, return the managed species back to the people of Montana.
Another issue I wanted to ask you about is there's a bill, I think, from some of your Republican colleagues in the House to prevent the Secretary of Interior from using closures of national parks under the guise of COVID restrictions. What are your thoughts on that? And I think Glacier National Park is also implementing something like a reservation system to cap attendance. Have you had any thoughts on that?
Well, I work closely with our superintendents, who, by the way, when we had going through the COVID pandemic just in the last season, it was very important that we opened up our national parks. You think about social distancing, boy, there's no better way to kind of help people get through a pandemic than to get them in the great outdoors. In fact, I saw a t-shirt the other day that said, Montana practicing social distancing since 1889. That was statehood. I mean, we're used to that in a place like Montana. And so I hope we would keep our national parks open. Yes, take the proper precautions in places where you might have more concentration of people, but it is much better to open our parks, not close and restrict them, during a pandemic. One, for the physical health, but also mental health. The American people, we need to be outdoors more. And the more you're outdoors, frankly, it helps the mind.
Yes, a lot of people have been recreating responsibly. I think that's a campaign that a lot of people in the outdoor industry have been touting and promoting. And it's kind of counterintuitive to the public lands ethos to restrict public lands access. I think it was a New York Post article that said that sometimes this is a tool by kind of preservationists, environmentalists to restrict access, which is very counterintuitive and very much against what the national park stood for the benefit and enjoyment of all. And hopefully they don't take that route. And I also want to ask you, kind of segueing into firearms, and while the Second Amendment has nothing to do with hunting, and that has to be made very perfectly clear, I think an argument you and your fellow Republicans, I think you make this well, but I think some of your other Republicans can make the argument that if you push gun control policies or you restrict the ability of people to legally procure and purchase firearms, you're going to have a very big shortage and diminishment of conservation dollars when Pittsman-Robertson funds are not flowing. So what are your thoughts on that? Is that an argument that you hope to make? And what gun control policies also concern you right now?
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. The first point you made there, Gabriella, as it relates to, I think it's important that we continue to teach an understanding of the Second Amendment to future generations, that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were not in a room. They're concerned about the threat of whitetails or antelope. And that's why we needed to be able to have firearms. Remember, the Second Amendment is not about hunting. It is about liberty. It is about freedom. And that's a very important foundational principle, understanding why we have the Second Amendment, right? Which followed the First Amendment, which is protecting critical rights on speech and religion and freedom of the press and petition and so forth. But to your point around the connection to hunting, and that is, if you want to, first of all, preserve the great outdoors and preserve wildlife, you need to continue to encourage hunting, because some of those dollars flow towards conservation and protection species. We see that in Africa. I've never been over to Africa to hunt, but if you actually hunt in Africa, if they allow it, it actually generates funds to go after the poachers. You actually protect a species when you hunt a species. It's counterintuitive to many who don't understand the outdoors, understand hunting. So that point around was related to gun control. If you start shutting down to be able to procure firearms or ammunition, that will have an effect on conservation in a negative way, which again might seem counterintuitive to those who understand really what hunting is all about here in terms of actually protecting and promoting wildlife.
That's very true. What particular bills have concerned you? I think I saw a report that President Biden is going to propose removing immunity from suing gun manufacturers. That's something that's, I think, come down the pipeline. What else from the administration or from your colleagues has kind of concerned you and really prompted you to speak out?
Well, there's a number of things. As you see, the folks who believe that somehow the gun control is going to make us safer, which again, over and over again, proves the fact that these gun control laws ultimately do not result in safer communities. In the communities and cities that have the strictest gun control laws oftentimes have the most dangerous outcomes from violence. So I look at other concerns are some of these backdoor channels that the left is going here as it relates to gun control. You mentioned immunity here for firearm manufacturers, taking that away. But also, they're going after financial institutions that seek to loan dollars here to a very legitimate industry. And so that's another concern that we have here, where if they can't accomplish their goals here through executive order or through legislative action, they do it kind of this woke capitalism we're starting to see more of, this progressive ideology that's going after the firearms industry. And that's another concern I have here that we've got to be battling at the moment. And so it's a battle we're fighting right now in Washington, but not just here in the city. It's across our country. Have
you taken a look at or explored 30 by 30, that initiative to section off 30% of public waters and public lands? And do you worry that sportsmen and women are not going to have a seat at the table for that?
Yeah, I do. And that's something that, the devil's in the details in terms of what's there. But I think as we start to unpack it and see what the real goal here is, I think the goal here is to lock up more of our public lands. Now, I'm not opposed to wilderness. I have actually moved legislation that actually has created some additional wilderness in a place like Montana. My wife and I love to backpack in wilderness areas. We can I've probably spent more time in wilderness areas than probably most members of Congress. But I think it's the balance that we seek here is multiple use approach, because guess what? Not every Montanan can get access to wilderness. There are issues here with physical disabilities and so forth. We got to continue to protect the ability to allow motorized vehicles into our public lands. And so that's the balance that we seek. And I think the 30 by 30 initiative is, again, maybe another way to lock up more of our public lands and actually diminishes access. What we need to keep working on here is promoting better access to our public lands. I'm afraid the 30 by 30 is, again, maybe a backdoor way here to actually restrict access for multiple use for many, many Americans who love their public lands.
And we do sometimes see that maneuver implemented when it's national monument designations. I know your colleague, Senator Lee, is speaking out against that. And I know you guys are going to be probably weighing whether or not to congressionally update that bill. But also something kind of I want to end on, being an avid hunter and angler, you've probably observed that many people are taking to the field. They're going hunting for the first time. They're going fishing for the first time. As someone who wields a lot of influence and who partakes in this, what is your advice to people who want to pick up these activities for the first time? What would you recommend? What style? What species?
Well, first of all, go for it. You think oftentimes fishing and hunting and outdoors is something that's passed on along families. And maybe it was a father, a mother, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin that got you out to catch that first fish as a kid. But for those who didn't have that experience growing up, it's very important we keep the next generation going forward here of buying a fishing license, buying hunting licenses, because that funds conservation. It funds the great outdoors. And I tell you, if you're interested in fly fishing, you come to a place like Montana, if you can afford to hire a guide to get out on a river and get on a McKinsey boat, it's a great way to learn the sport of fly fishing. Because if you saw Brad Pitt and his stunt double on the river runs through it, he's making these huge casts with his fly rod. Well, when you're in a McKinsey boat, you'll have to cast about 10 or 20 feet out of the boat there, and you'll catch your first trout. And when you hook that first fish, you'll be hooked on the sport probably for the rest of your life.
It is so true. I've just started fly fishing. Not largely because I've watched the film, which is a great film. I've done mostly bait and spin cast, but it is so true. I like wading on the water, and I actually just caught my first shad on the fly in the Rappahannock recently. But wading is great. Floating from a boat is also awesome too. And it's been wonderful to chat with you, Senator Daines. Where could people connect with you, follow your musings, follow your legislation, and probably get some inspiration to go hunting and fishing?
Yeah, well, we're on Instagram, of course, Twitter, Facebook. You can find us by doing a search on Steve Daines. But I can tell you on my Instagram account, those are all I do that alone. Nobody touches that.
Oh.
Tom Seam touches my Instagram account. So, and I try to actually capture more of the Montana way of life there. I try to make it, non-political. Generally, sometimes, you throw something that might have a political bent to it, but generally it's just pictures of the landscapes of Montana. I call it pics from the pickup. I literally drive around my Ford pickup. I'll see, a nice an antelope or a deer or an elk or so forth, or herd of elk. I'll take a quick picture out of the window of the pickup, and I'll post it. So you can go check that. We try to keep it focused on the great outdoors in Montana.
Love it. That's wonderful. And maybe post-COVID or something, I may try to do some series where I try to get lawmakers like yourself to do outdoor activities, but hopefully maybe I'll talk with your staff and maybe we can do some fishing together or something of that nature to kind of highlight that lawmakers don't just wear stuffy suits and talk policy all the time.
I can tell you right now, we're into spring bear. It opened up April 15th. So I've got my 300 Win Mag, and I'm waiting for a couple more weeks here before really, I think, you get prime time of spring bear hunting in Montana. But
oh my gosh,
I'll be out there chasing spring bear here.
Nice.
In Montana. So it's one thing about when you hunt predators, it lengthens your hunting season, because you really almost get to hunt 10 or 12 months of the year when you add predators to your hunting list.
Yes. And sadly, that type of hunting is controversial to some people, but hopefully they'll start to understand and maybe you can shed light on it. But Senator Daines, it's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you for what you're doing in the Senate. I appreciate your time, and hopefully I'll get to interface with you in person sometime soon.
Look forward to it, Gabrielle. Thank you.